Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Sage Campus webinar, this time on doing research with historically marginalized communities. I'm going to allow people to join us, so just give it a couple of, maybe a minute. But I just wanted to start with some housekeeping before we go into the presentations. So first, please feel free to ask all your questions using the Q&A function, which you should see at the bottom of your screen. We will address them at the end, but you can start sending your questions now. And lastly, today's session is being recorded, so we will share the recording with everyone who has attended or registered for those who weren't able to be here today with us. So I think that is also, we're going to get started. So hello again, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar about doing research with historically marginalized communities. I am Pia, the Senior Marketing Manager for Sage Campus, and today I'm joined by two very special guests, Dr. Shatonda Jones and Dr. Toy Jones. I'll let them introduce themselves in a moment, but I also wanted to quickly explain who we are and why we're doing this webinar today. So if we go to the next slide. So Sage Campus is a library resource created by Sage, offering a suite of online courses covering key skills and research methods across all stages of academic study. Our courses are developed by experts, such as the two speakers that we have here today, and they are all self-paced to suit learners and busy schedules. So I think we are now ready to start. So I'm going to hand it over to our speakers and I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Okay, and I will start sharing my screen. Give me 2 seconds here. Let me get us into presentation mode. And so Toy and I would like to extend a big thank you to Sage and Sage Campus for inviting us to come out and talk to you all today via this webinar on research with historically, socially marginalized populations. We'll start with just introducing ourselves and kind of let you know who we are, because that's kind of part of doing this type of work, is to, be very transparent in who we are as people and, some of the identities that we hold. But then we'll kind of pivot into some of the, core things that we've discussed in a couple of courses. But then we want to make sure that this is a dialogue and that you get an opportunity to kind of hear from our experiences, and that, you feel very, very encouraged to, ask questions or share experiences of your own. But this is how we build community, especially in this space. So I'll ask my sister, which, yes, Toy is my actual sister, like blood sister, to introduce herself first, and then I'll introduce myself.
Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here and happy to be engaged in this dialogue. So a bit about me and what brings me here, other than being my sister. I am an associate professor in the Department of Psychology, as well as I'm the director of women's studies at Xavier University of Louisiana. I was just telling my colleagues on the call that we're in carnival season and we just got out of the Super Bowl. We're in carnival season, so if you hear something in the background, we're in carnival season, and people are very excited about that, as am I. So before my role at Xavier, I was working clinically in university counseling centers and community mental health, and doing grassroots kind of mobilizing things. And so that brought me in contact with folk who have identities that are situated at the margins or historically marginalized communities. So in addition to that, working clinically and that being the focus of my research, working with marginalized communities, especially Black identified women, femme, and queer identified folk. I'm a mixed methods researcher. I'm a qualitative researcher. So people's stories and hearing their lived experience is very important to me. And so that's what also brought me to this work as well. And so I'll turn it over to Dr. Jones.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. So my name is Shatonda Jones, and I am an associate professor and the director of clinical education in the newly developing distance education Master of Science in Speech Language Pathology program at St. Bonaventure University. Go Bonas. I have around 20 years experience as a speech language pathologist, exclusively working with adults and geriatrics with neurogenic communication and swallowing disorders. My research primarily focuses on building health capacity in communities. My PhD by training is not in speech language pathology, it's in therapeutic sciences, which is an interdisciplinary field that looks at how we view disablement in communities and how we can make the world be more responsive to disablement instead of the person having to take the ownership of their disability and trying to fit into the world that's not necessarily made for them. I am also a brain injury specialist trainer, certified brain injury specialist trainer, and I am currently working on another master's degree in pastoral studies. And in the fall, we'll be working on another doctorate, research doctorate in theology, where I will pursue womanist theological perspectives of the intersections of health, education, and spirituality. So that's a little bit about us, and I hope you see that. Oh, and I should say, qualitative mixed methods is my jam. I love quantitative too, but I love qual. I like getting all warm and fuzzy with people. But hopefully you can see from us that we have varied experiences, a wide range of topics that we're interested in, which is all kind of converged into this really being very we want to be very careful and very intentional about the work we do with the communities that we are like allowed to come into. I know Toy will speak to or Dr. Jones will speak to this. I'll speak to it about working with geriatrics, which I am not yet part of as we go along. But we know that it's an honor to be in those communities and that it's only by their grace that we're allowed to do the works that we do. So briefly, our session outcomes for today. We hope that we get to engage in conversation about, how to design research that reflects the needs and experiences of marginalized communities, recognizing that we only have around an hour together and really like 40 minutes that we cannot at all get through everything. But hopefully for those of you that maybe this is newer, it whets your appetite. And for those of you that this is old hat, if you're in this space that we are constantly learning and having to revisit the things we've learned before. And then we also hope to identify some strategies for respectfully gaining access to these communities and building trust, and then discuss the critical roles of ethics in research, including principles that we probably all here know, but beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, justice, and respect for persons. So as we go through the presentation, we want you to think about the groups or communities with whom you currently work, would like to work, or envision yourself working with in the future, and think about how you interact with those communities from start of the research project through completion, which includes dissemination and then work that comes after dissemination. This is going to help us later in our discussions. And then before we begin, I think, especially for those of you that are joining us from the States and maybe, have like grant funding, and we know we're kind of in a precarious like stage right now in research, we wanted to do an acknowledgement. So I'm just going to read this straight out. And so we would like to begin by acknowledging all historically marginalized, minoritized, and underserved populations around the world. Their contributions to research and their willingness to advance knowledge, often in the face of systemic barriers, are acts of profound generosity and resilience. May we continue striving toward a world where all can fully participate in the pursuit of knowledge without limitation. And then Toy or Dr. Jones will read this one. I'll read it and then Toy will
I was
like
about
kind
to
of
say, am I reading it?
Yes, no, I'll read it. Toy will talk about it. Well, I promise you all, we totally did a dress rehearsal last night. Okay. So this is to our colleagues, and this is what stems from like what's going on like in the States, but worldwide, just the climate of research. And we know that scholarship, research, higher education is constantly changing, but we want to recognize that the landscape of research and research funding is changing in ways that we never imagined would happen. And with it, the ways in which we can continue to safely engage with communities. In this time of uncertainty, our commitment to ethical, inclusive, and respectful research remains steadfast.
Mhm. And so I just want to highlight, because I'm mindful that when me and Dr. Jones was doing this research, we were in spaces with community of folk who recognize that saying things like historically marginalized, saying things like white supremacy, racism, that's just a part of the work, and it's been substantiated by the scholarship. It's situated in the academy where we just know these things and we have the data to back it up. However, we're currently in a space, and I speak from personal experience, and even some of the feedback that Dr. Jones and I received, where there has been an intentional attack on changing the language. So moving from moving from terms such as historically marginalized, which best captures the picture of a lot of the folk we seek to serve in our research because of their lived experience and because of the systems of injustice. There's been a push to move to language such as vulnerable populations, right? And we know that that term is also very important, but the push to move historically marginalized out the way and then to lift this term is intentional because of whatever level of discomfort it might cause for folk who have not done the cultural self-reflection. So we're intentional about using these terms. So you won't hear us lift that often, vulnerable populations, although we do by all means understand and know that that's a term, or folk moving us away from, again, historically marginalized to talking about health impacts. And these are directives that we're receiving from grant funders and from folk who have the monies to continue this research, right? But so Dr. Jones and I are not only a part of a radical tradition that says to call a thing, and so you will see us very intentionally committed to using this throughout our presentation and our work. So I just wanted to bring that up for folk that if you're listening, you might be saying, oh, I just received an executive order of not to use this word in my research. I would want to call upon you all in the audience, the virtual audience, that if you are a part of the academy, you also have been called to do the work that has been substantiated by the research. And so that means calling a thing a thing. And for us in this work is historically, socially marginalized populations.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. With that, we want to ask you all, and I'm going to end the show here, and I'm going to put up a poll as soon as I activate it, and we're going to ask you all to share with us what are your intersecting identities. Now, this is a free version of Poll Everywhere, and so of course there's only going to be like 25 responses available, but whoever gets in first, yay, you get the gold star for today. But we're going to talk about this later, and it's more not for you to feel called out because some identities are very near, dear, and need to be more protected. We all have them, but this is more for you to start thinking about those intersecting identities as we start talking about being in community and doing research in communities. How would you feel if a researcher decided to come and visit one of the communities or spaces that you occupy? So we want to just put that out there. I'm going to end it, or it'll be ongoing, so whoever wants to contribute. It is also anonymous because we also appreciate people's anonymity, if I could like actually talk. And then I am going to put this back into slideshow. And then like I said, we'll revisit this later on. It's also on the slide, so if you wanted to text or anything, and please, again, if we ask you questions, do not feel like you have to respond. You have the right to say, I don't want to answer that today, and that's totally okay. You can do this one though. So one more exercise as we get ready to get started into the content here. We don't want you to put this into the chat, the questions or anything, but this is more of a reflective exercise. And Dr. Jones and I both engage in a lot of reflective exercises that lead to a lot of discernment and honestly behavior changes for the most part. And I think a lot of researchers are like that. I mean, any of you that did a dissertation or a capstone probably looks back on that and says, whoa, I can't believe they let me graduate. I know I do. And so we're constantly challenging ourselves to kind of move forward. So we want to ask you this question as a point of reflection. What brings you here today to this webinar? And more specifically, what is or why do you have an interest in working with socially, historically marginalized communities and research? So again, we want you to just not respond in any tangible way, like so not in the questions and answers, but we want you just to really think about this. And we want you to also have a willingness to be honest with yourself. There's no right or wrong here, only spaces to grow, spaces to affirm, and spaces to validate. So we also know an hour-long session will not make anybody ready to work in marginalized communities. Much like I could say from a speech pathology perspective to a student, an hour-long course on motor speech disorders will not make you ready to go treat a client. But we want you to consider like why you're here and then ultimately why you're doing research in the community. Is it a curiosity, or are you doing research to help improve the lives of the people in which you'll be engaged in the research? Or is it something that like the funder sources are saying, hey, if you can tag this thing on it, then you might get extra funding or you might be pushed up to the higher tier of having your grant looked at. So it's just important for you to think about. And then, like, we'll talk about it more later when you hear a few of our stories about why we decided to engage in the research.
Can I add one thing, Dr. Jones?
Of course.
And in that reflection, if you find that there is discomfort, and so this is the psychologist in me talking, and I know Dr. Jones does this work too, but if you find that there's an area of discomfort as you reflect on what brings you here, I encourage you, as safe as possible, to lean into that, because that's also where this growth can happen, right? A lot of ways in which people enter into this research might be ill-informed because they have not been willing to address the discomfort or the areas that they just don't want to touch. But that's also important to be thinking about in terms of what brings you to the work and to the service, to the research that should be a service.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Jones. Like I'm big on like metaphors and stories and narratives, as is Dr. Jones. But I would offer, if you like how she said, if you're in a space of discomfort, lean into it. And if you need a reference point, think back to when you were a newer, younger researcher. You were uncomfortable with your topic. Like I know I was. Like I didn't have nearly the amount of knowledge I have now on my dissemination diffusion topic. And I had to lean into that discomfort and decide to study it. And so, very similarly, you're going to just have to do that. So, thank you so much, Dr. Jones, for mentioning that. All right. Like any good presenter, we're going to hit all the session objectives first before we deviate and have a discussion. So, the session objective here is to describe how to design research that reflects the needs and experiences of marginalized communities. But first, we need to understand what a socially, historically marginalized community is. So when we say that term, and Dr. Jones, jump in anytime, we are talking about individuals and communities and more communities that have been denied full access to social, economic, and political opportunities due to systemic discrimination, oppression, access, all of those things. These communities often are kind of narrowly focused in on in some spaces, but we're really thinking broadly. So we're thinking BIPOC communities, so Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. We're thinking women, especially in male-dominated fields or societies that, actually have a lot of gender inequity. We're thinking LGBTQ plus individuals, people with disabilities, people who have lower socioeconomic status or low income. We're thinking immigrants and refugees. We're thinking about people who are elderly, especially in societies that are ageist. And we're also thinking about religious minorities, particularly in regions that have a dominant faith structure. So we know that marginalization, how does that actually happen? It manifests through exclusion, lack of representation, and unequal distribution, which can shape health outcomes, educational outcomes, overall quality of life. And we know even representation and research that leads to real change in society can also be manifested there. We also are thinking about some of those structural and systemic barriers that actually affect the groups. And so these things might be like historical exclusion. And so sometimes folks are literally left out of, decision-making spaces, and that kind of reduces their autonomy. They become target, not agent. And so think about it even from this way. If we have research that says we're going to study pain, and we know that there are communities that are overburdened by pain, and we don't include them in the research for medications, then perhaps the interventions don't necessarily work in those communities. So research, policy discussions too are really important. Who's at the table making policies that will ultimately affect the communities in which they target? There's also health disparities, and we could have a whole 2.5 year series, in my humble little opinion, about health disparities, because that's one of my areas. But structural racism, economic inequalities, and the social determinants of health result in poor health outcomes for some communities. We can also talk about limited access to healthcare. We can talk about mistrust of medical institutions because of misdiagnosis, misattribution, and outright dismissal of some concerns. So those things. And then we could go into more of some of these barriers, like educational barriers. We can go into legal and policy constraints, and then mistrust in research and institutions. Think about it. We most researchers hold these fancy titles at these big institutions that seem so far removed from the community that maybe the community doesn't understand that they have a role and a right to most of our spaces. And then think about past unethical research practices. I think the one that probably always comes to mind is the Tuskegee syphilis study. We could say Henrietta Lacks. There's a lot more, and I think Dr. Jones has a lot more from her areas as well. But that those stories and others have bred a mistrust and a distrust in researchers that reflects that the community might feel like it's going to be exploited rather than having a true collaboration. And then the importance of community-led research and participatory practices. So with this one, I always joke and say, oh, Dr. Jones is so much better than me at this because she is out there really in community doing the work with people that have held a lot of trauma. I get to go hang out with older adults, and I think that's just fun. Like I get to sit in the room, play cards, talk about, how can we make you healthier? Both are community, but I always say, well, Dr. Jones is so much better than me, so I learn a lot from her. So here's your props, my little sister.
Thank
Um,
you.
so, uh-huh. So what's the importance of this community-led research and these participatory approaches? What we're really getting at here is we're trying to build trust in these communities. So we don't do research on communities, we do research with communities. And so what this helps to do is say to the community, we're here in service to you. And those of you in the academy might say, oh, yeah, we have teach and scholarship and service, right? Service is also research. In our opinion, my service to my community, to other communities, to this world, everywhere is a service. I have been gifted with some skills and privileged to go to the institutions I've gone to be trained. And so this is my give back. Whenever I publish a paper or whenever I go out and do research and do something with that research to build capacity in the community, I'm like, that's service to me. And communities will look very favorably upon that. It's like we're not just coming in to get something because we know as researchers, especially those of us in the academy, we need research to get tenure and promoted and all that good stuff. But it's not just that. It's kind of like, here's my give back for all the things I've been given. So that humbleness or that humility comes out. It also helps us with cultural competence and sensitivity as well. So by engaging with community leaders and cultural advisors, we're saying to the community, we're not the experts of your community, and there is never one person that speaks for an entire community. Instead, we're saying we're willing to hear from as many people as we can to get a fuller, not full, but fuller picture of what's going on. So that way we can approach the community in a more robust way. We also think about shared power and decision making. We also think about the ethical considerations, which we'll talk about here in just a second. And then sustainability and impact. Like, so going into the community to do research just shouldn't be because, oh, I just have an interest in something. Like, I can say the research I've done with stroke survivors literally comes out of my sister and I's background, but then also because I want to make stroke a thing of the past. I like always tell my community members I do research with that I hope I get put out of my job at some point. Like when I am 90, I hope there is no more need for my discipline because we have gotten to a space where everybody is super healthy and they always look at me like, how will you make money? And I'm like, I don't know. Like, but that is my goal. So that's what we mean there. Now, how do we get there? One, and this is just one, we could talk about a whole bunch of ways to actually do methodologies that would be better in historically marginalized communities. And let me say a caveat here too, and say there's not one way. Survey research can be done in historically socially marginalized communities. Lab research, sorry, I'm not a, I'm not in the laboratory, but lab research can be done in a great way. I would say a framework, though. CBPR, community-based participatory research, helps to kind of umbrella all of our other or helps to umbrella our methodologies, and it involves community partners as equal partners in the research project or process. So what it does, it prioritizes co-learning, capacity building, and shared decision making, and the goal is to ensure that research is not only academically rigorous, but also relevant and beneficial to the community. So some of these methodologies, we need to know that communities being involved is crucial. So even for those of us that maybe are in the laboratory, and I am sorry to my biology, chemistry, and physics colleagues that I'm like not as skilled with that. I'm a health scientist and a liberal arts person, okay? Leave me alone. But even in that, if I'm going to go and take blood samples, for example, to study a new cancer drug, so cancer trials, I need to have community involved, especially if it's going to, like, let's say I'm studying breast cancer in women aged 40 to 60. Even if I don't think the community would understand the nuances of gene variants, it's still important to engage the community in saying, hey, what do you think about this work? We're going to embark on this, and you are a survivor or the family member of a survivor or somebody who didn't survive. Having those kind of advocates, advisors is really important. And then with other culturally responsive methodologies, we try to integrate the culture's values, their traditions, and community knowledge into the research process to give us a more full picture. So again, this just enhances trust. We're trying to prioritize the lived experiences in the community and the voices in the research design all the time. All right, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Jones.
Okay, so accessing communities and building trust. We kind of spoke to it a bit earlier, but I want to bring us back to the importance of cultural self-reflection and everything that Dr. Jones has already discussed. So until we get to that point where you can really be able to engage in a cultural self-reflection where you're willing to acknowledge what your bigotries might be, any biases that you might have, areas of growth, and really working to address those, recognizing that this is an ongoing process, cultural humility, right? That we have to always be engaged in this practice, you won't be able to make it to this second objective that we're talking about. There has to be an unapologetic willingness to say, oh, wow, I have a bigotry in this area, or I don't have enough information in this area, or I need to learn more about this group, but most importantly, I need to learn more about myself before I can even begin to take the steps to ask for access or to be invited into this space that can then lead to rapport and building trust, right? So identify oh, that's okay. That's okay.
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to read it. That's all good. Identify strategies for respectfully gaining access to these communities and building trust. So there are, you can go on to the next. Thank you, Dr.
This is what happens when you present with your sister, that you just kind of anticipate. It's like I've known her my whole life. So,
And she's like, you're ready to go. Okay.
you're ready to go. Moving.
So there are several things that you could and should be doing before you ask for permission to enter in said community that's historically marginalized, right? And so again, just to reiterate, before you even ask for permission, you should be engaged in a ongoing cultural self-reflection about where you are. Culture shifts all the time. Historically marginalized expands, right? Once things change, policies change, these things, grow and expand, and people have to figure out where they might fall in this space. And I forgot to mention that I'm trained as a counseling psychologist. So of course I'm saying you need to be engaged in a cultural self-reflection and always be monitoring and thinking about how you're feeling, what you're thinking, having that congruence so that you know yourself well enough before you even ask for permission to be in these spaces, right? So there's several things that you can be doing. Before entering into the space, before you want to engage with or collaborate, but just to highlight a few. So establishing relationships with community leaders and members. And we'll talk about it a bit more later on once Dr. Jones and I are in dialogue about some of our cases that we've worked with. So research cases that we'll share with you all. But so this establishing relationships, establishing rapport, it's important for you to posture yourself as a researcher that you are willing to be checked. So if I can just be kind of social for a moment, you have to willing to be checked. So you have to be willing for someone to tell you, I don't like what you did there. That was harmful. That's wrong. You don't know my community, and to not get defensive about it. So this non-defensive posture, this posture of I'm here to learn, but I don't expect the historically marginalized community to teach me about their community is so important for building that trust. They want to know that they're working with researchers that when they arrive, they're not like, okay, let let me tell you everything about myself so that you are informed. Don't make your participants do the work for you, right? So that's important. Another thing that's important to establish rapport and relationship is that oftentimes, I know in both Dr. Jones and I and my work, we'll do a needs assessment. Again, that goes back to what she was saying earlier. Is it a curiosity? And if it is a curiosity, does that serve the community? Because we're talking about entering into spaces where curiosities can be harmful. And so is your research in service too? And if it is, if in community with the people you seek to serve and they tell you this is what we need, and you say, no, this is what I want to do, then you're in conflict with the community and perhaps not really in service. So a needs assessment to see what's going on, what would be of best interest. The other bullet here, co-developing research priorities with community members, which can come out of that needs assessment. So if the members and the leaders say that we need X, Y, and Z, and they don't necessarily have the skill set because we've been given access to the academy and to these specialized skills, then you take the time to introduce them and even show them how to use the skills. So it's not atypical that when Dr. Jones and I are doing research in communities, that we're training them on the methodologies that we're using. They're sitting right alongside us and they're giving us feedback, we're giving them feedback, but all of this can also be done because we've established a relationship that's been built on trust and we've been invited into the space, recognizing that at any point in time, they can check us and we're like, okay, you're right, my fault. Okay, let me step back and see what I can learn from it. So developing the priorities with the community, so to make sure that they are in service to the community. Transparency, so ensuring transparency and reciprocity in the research process. So remember that the people that we're seeking to serve through our research are the experts on their own lived experience. You're not coming in with anything that would be better than what they have to share. I know that we have expert knowledge. We are situated in the scholarship, the ongoing scholarship that improves, innovates, expands. And at the end of the day, that person in that community knows more about their walk than we ever will. And so to be engaged in a process where it's transparent, it's reciprocal, where they know exactly what you are doing, and they can tell you in response what they are doing because you've built a trust in that way, is vital to doing this research. It's vital to building that relationship. It's vital to building that trust. So for folk who are, well, I won't even say familiar because Dr. Jones has been talking about it, but so mixed methods research, qualitative research, which is also my jam, okay, which is also my jam. You should be familiar with member checks, right? So that's an example of, even in the quantitative space, I'm sure there's a way that you could integrate member checks. So member checks is you've collected the data, whether mixed methods or qualitative, you began to do the first level of analysis to see what themes emerge, your exploratory notes, you've made comments, and then you go back to the person that is your interlocutor in that qualitative research or that mixed methods research, and you say, hey, this is what I found so far. Does this represent you? Did I get it right? And I know there are oftentimes the feedback is not necessarily best informed feedback is, oh, we have to have protection around the data. Yeah, we also need to have safety around the data too. So if I'm trying to get a better understanding of your lived experience, a member check in that first level of analysis helps to further establish that rapport, that trust, and that relationship that the research could be ongoing. So I need to go back to said person or my interlocutor and say, hey, this is what I'm seeing emerging. Does this feel like it captures our conversation together? And if they're like, no, it doesn't capture it at all, that is great data for me and also a growing space, right? That, oh, okay, I need to go back to my reflexivity statements. I need to go back to what I did in preparation because I don't want to harm or misunderstand the research, right? So that could be, feedback for you too. But if they're like, yeah, this captures it, it further builds the relationship. And even if the feedback is, no, you didn't get it at all, you missed the whole thing, that also builds the relationship because they're like, wow, you want to make sure you hear me and that you are understanding my story, and I appreciate that.
All right, Dr. Jones, I'm going to take a 2-second brain break and
Okay.
just say, tell us that, or show us that we are geriatric millennials without showing us for geriatric millennials, we have said, check yourself, and that's my jam because
Oh
we are
man.
geriatric. I
And our
know.
students remind us of this, right? They be like,
They
jam. Oh,
do
what's she
all the
talking about?
time. They
You on
don't
your
know
jam?
that slang. They don't know that slang at all. But like, you know what? We will, children of the
Oh,
90s and early
yeah. I
2000s.
forgot. Check yourself is not a thing, is it? I'm thinking that I'm eating with that. Like, oh, you better check.
Is
Okay.
no. And back in my day, we used to say, check yourself before you wreck yourself because we
Oh
were so
man.
cool in the 90s. I'm sorry, every once in a while, y'all, we have to take just a tiny bit of a brain break to the stuff
Mhm.
that kind of floats up for us is like, whoa, did we just say that out loud? And
Yeah.
that's another process of like, oh, if I'm going to be relevant to my students, I better go get some more slang other than what was happening when the Backstreet Boys were, out there.
I wouldn't have even cited the Backstreet Boys, but okay. But can
I
I
love the
take
Backstreet.
a quick tangent to connect it back though? This
Yes.
research is heavy, y'all. And
Yes.
so, especially as Black identified women who are doing work in the space where we share a lot with our interlocutors, it's important to have joy. So, part of doing good research, building trust, building rapport is that outside of the research, you have to be engaged in continuous joy. You have to make sure you have those spaces where you are getting joy. Because if you're doing the research right, it should be heavy.
Yeah.
Because working with historically marginalized communities is heavy, important work. So when you're not doing that work, having that joy is what's going to sustain you. So then when you go back to that research space, you are committed to the process because you're not void of the joy that you have. So doing this research with my sister brings me so much joy. Oh my
Oh,
goodness.
same. Same. I might even say, like, I'm going to share a little bit about the community as co-PI. And you see a picture here of Palestine Missionary Baptist Church of Jesus Christ. And I was constantly reminded by my community co-PIs that if I don't say that whole entire statement every single time I reference the church, I am in error and I am not respecting them. So I have learned how to say that. Mind you, our grandmother's house is like not even a block away from this church. It's like you could throw a rock and hit this church where my grandma and granddad lived when we were little. So I want to share this in response to, the idea of gaining access and building trust. And just briefly, so a project that I did, gosh, it had to be like 10 years ago now. I've been doing a lot. I've grown up a lot. We actually, it was four of us who were researchers. We actually contacted this church and said, do you have people who would like to engage in research with us? We weren't sure what we wanted to do because we hadn't done a needs assessment for the community, but we knew that there was a pretty decent chunk of funding that was being distributed worldwide by a foundation, or sorry, nationwide by a foundation, and that since all the researchers lived in Kansas City and we were from diverse backgrounds, as diverse as you can get, we wanted to get some of that money to help some kind of health initiative in the community. So our first step is we just had a meeting with some of the people who were the leaders of the church, and it did not include the pastor, by the way. They set us up with just folks who were super active. Come to find out, one of them is actually a cousin of ours. We had no clue, so we met family through this process. But ultimately, those members, there's like four other people besides the research trained folks, became PIs on the project. Everything that got written up, every dissemination that we did, which was more, going out into the community talking about things, and then developing community programs, their names were on it. And we also negotiated authorship for any of the projects. So when it was more centered in like, community things, like, so we ended up developing a grandparents who were raising grandchildren support group based on the data we collected. And that's what the community ultimately said they really wanted. The primary author or the first author were the community people. And we all kind of negotiated authorship after them. I think I ended up at like ninth or eighth on it because I kind of filtered out later on. But that was incredible. We had this team of 8 people who were together. Like, I was teaching how to do qualitative data collection. One of my colleagues was more skilled at quantitative data collection and analysis. Another colleague was more skilled at grant writing. And then our community co-PIs, one of them was skilled at how to get people or how to recruit people into the project. And I remember she was like around I think she was like 70 years old at that point, retired registered nurse. She would literally grab me by the hand and take me around to different people in our community center and say, you ask them because they can ask 5 other people. And bet to shout, we were getting so many people that would come and talk to us. And then one was, she was an educator in the community who everyone knew was just very like fond of. She got us into a whole living facility that was dedicated to grandparents raising children. We could not have gained access to that as researchers without her. So want to highlight that, like, there's so much more to that story, but that is the work I've done with Palestine Missionary Baptist Church of Jesus Christ, which forever in a day I will say that whole thing out. I cannot just say the one thing because I can hear one of our 70-year-old co-PI. She passed away this year, and she was our cousin. So I hear her, Miss Barbara, in my ear saying, "You say the whole thing," and I had to be willing to be like, "Okay, okay, I got you, sis. It's fine. Don't worry about it." Um, so ethics now. Everybody is well versed in ethics. We all, like, if you're a researcher, you have some kind of research ethics training, and we go through these things. So let me just kind of show these really quick. So beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, justice, and respect for persons. We know the definitions of these, but we also want to think about, like, how do we actually apply them or put them in context? So beneficence, maximizing the benefits and minimizing harm. When we go and seek out, like, support from the community, do that needs assessment, we're really prioritizing beneficence. We're saying we want to know what you need or what you would like from us, and that can be nothing at all. Great. If you don't need anything, wonderful, we will go and do something else. Here's our contact information if you think we could be of service to you. Non-malfeasance. um, One thing I was thinking about, like, Dr. Jones and I were talking a little bit last night, and I said one of the communities that I'm super interested in that I've not done any work yet beyond just reading is people who are incarcerated, because I think there's a lot tied up in education, health, and spirituality with that community. But one thing, like, she said to me when we are talking about non-malfeasance, she said, we got to make sure we're not creating spaces that increase surveillance of a community. So if I'm really interested in looking or talking to people who, have been incarcerated and what their experiences are, I don't want to draw that attention to them to where they become targeted again, because that would be not avoiding exploitation or harm. Autonomy, people have the right to say no. I have been told by so many in my dissertation work, I cannot tell you the number of 85-year-olds that told me, nope, not going to do that. I don't know you. And I'm like, okay. And those of you that have done a dissertation, you're under the crunch and you just want to graduate. And then you go back and you cry to your advisor that nobody wants to talk to me. And you finally say, I have to respect you. And then you go adopt another site to try to get the data. Like, you just keep going. Justice, we want to make sure that whatever we do, there's an outcome for the community, that they get some kind of benefit and that they are represented in that. And it's like, again, goes back to capacity building and making sure that we're giving communities the tools and the things that they need in order to continue to flourish. We're there for a short period of time. And as soon as we're gone, we don't want our legacy, or not legacy, that's a bad word. We don't want our time there to be of non-import, right? I would also argue that justice says that once I'm committed to a community and do research with them, I'm there for the long haul. So the communities I talk about, Palestine Missionary Church or Jesus Christ, I just messed that up. And I hear Miss Barbara saying, "Whoa, I'm gonna get you." I'm still connected to the people there. Like, even though I'm not on the research team anymore because I've moved on, I still, like, have contact. And I'm like, anything you need from speech pathology services, let me know. I can be there for you. And then respect for persons, just recognizing that those cultural values and identities, of course, like, if you go into a community, we do not put our own cultural lens onto the community. We learn through, I mean, we could even say, like, doing some ethnography work, you're learning about people, right? The other thing, and I'm giving all credit to Dr. Jones for reminding me of this the other day. But don't forget that ethical considerations apply to your co-researchers from historically, socially marginalized communities as well. How many times have Dr. Jones and I been asked, what do you think the community thinks? And she and I both work, like, we both work in Black American spaces quite a bit, right? We both work in female spaces quite a bit. I work a lot in neurological condition spaces, and I'm a person that has some neurological health issues. I cannot speak for everybody, even though I hold those identities. It's just there's no way to do that. Nor in my capacity as a researcher should I be the one speaking for those communities because I hold a different privilege at that point. Dr. Jones, you want to say anything about that before I move
Yeah.
on?
I was just gonna add, even if you, how do I want to say this? Because it also gets into this idea of exploitation of labor. And
Mm.
so you want to make sure that you're not exploiting the labor of your co-researcher or even the PI if they also are situated at the intersection of marginalized identities and having them lead everything. The emotional toll might be a bit different for them. So it's important to be checking in and to be doing your share. And if there's areas of growth or that, you just don't have, that you're also educating yourself along the way. But yeah, I was just going to add the piece of exploitation of labor because we often find for the historically marginalized, especially when the identities are visible, that there is this not discussed but expectation. And the work that I do is often with BIPOC folk, especially Black identified women, and there's a whole long substantiated data set and research in the humanities and everything about the exploitation of Black women's bodies. And so it's important to think about how that can transcend into other spaces. And you just want to make sure you're applying the ethical considerations across the board. The folk that you choose to serve, the leaders that you're working with, and your co-researchers that might be situated at the intersection of marginalized identities.
Yeah, I don't know. I can also add too, Dr. Jones, that for those people who are from historically socially marginalized backgrounds serving as researchers, hold boundaries too. You
Mhm.
have to be willing to say, like, no, that is not appropriate for me to be engaged in right now, and be willing to say I can't speak for the community. I mean, so boundary
Yeah.
setting on that end as well.
And geriatric millennial, check them.
Yeah, I can.
Gotta
You
check them.
I think that's the beauty of being a researcher, especially on these like teams of, other folks that are like trained. So talking about just from my PhD program long ago, that's what we did. We had a class where we all just read articles, and then when somebody had an idea that was off target, we would check them. And that was like we
Yeah.
got graded on our ability to engage in the hard work of having difficult conversations. And I
Yeah.
love our program for that.
And I'm mindful of your program. We went to the same university. There was,
Yeah.
an expectation that if you are checked, do you get defensive about it?
Yes,
Because we know in grad school, you can't be defensive about the feedback that you receive. Otherwise, it's going to be a long struggle journey. And
it
so,
is.
yeah, I remember that being your ability to check, but also being willing to receive the check and how you respond.
And trust when you're in a cohort of two and all the other cohorts are between 2 and 3 and you're getting checked regularly in class, you grow a real thick skin and you go out into the community, you're like, you can't do anything that my advisors have not already done to me. Like
And
they've
you expand your empathy. You expand your
yes,
empathy.
does. I think now as professors, my sister and I have the most empathy first, and we will check our students, but we also are like, we are checking you in the spirit of love.
Yeah,
So
we want to
like
see you
we
win.
we want to see you win. We're not going to make you go home and cry and throw your laptop across the room with me. I've done that before.
Yeah.
Okay, as we're winding up, I want to make sure to leave plenty of time for like a theory to practice conversation. And so just this, I just added this slide here just to kind of say, incorporating community advisory boards. I actually serve on one for NIH and other big federal grant projects as a community member, not as a researcher. I have this cool background where I can speak a little bit differently than the other community advisory board members, but I usually kind of try to take that out of it. And it's been phenomenal to kind of sit in that side of the world and be like I just did one or did a board meeting the other day where I had to ask someone who was doing blood sample analysis, have you asked the community from which you got those blood samples? Is it okay if you use it in a new way? And they're like, oh, but they signed a new, they sign, a consent document. And I'm like, yeah, but I wonder if it might be interesting, something to consider. Just, shooting out a mass email saying, hey, this is how your bio products are helping the community now. Like, and not that that always can be done, but just having the idea of it, saying that, I'm committed to making sure that, folks understand their participation in research. Here, storytelling and qualitative methods help to amplify voices, and then advocating for policy change, which I think we've talked about just a little bit. So I'm going to turn it over because I think Dr. Jones has a really cool story that I want to make sure we have time
I'm
for.
also mindful of time, so I don't know if I'm gonna go in great detail about the story because I know we want to get to questions and
Yes.
answers. But so I'll just kind of give the gist.
Okay.
Again, reiterating the cultural self-reflection and the internal work, exploring intersectional identities and all that comes with these for yourself as the researcher, being open to being checked, getting feedback so that you can correct disruptive behaviors. Again, this kind of ongoing commitment to cultural humility and having a non-defensive posture, right? So the theory to practice, I was going to share a quick, well, it was not quick, but I was going to share a case study that I think can highlight for many of us and perhaps a not really discussed way why it is important to be engaged in this work. So I'm not going to go into the whole thing, so I want to make sure I leave room. But the clinical research case study that I was going to give was that as a researcher, so again, I'm a counseling psychologist by training. I direct women's studies. I'm engaged in research that looks at sexual violence, trauma, sisterhood connection, community building, interventions for the community, and all the beautiful things that I could get into detail about. But said research brought me to a space where I was in community with folk that were Black and queer identified. And so it's clear that I am a Black woman. What had not been disclosed yet was anyone's sexual orientation. And so we were just kind of getting to the beginnings of it, sharing information, talking about what the research was like, trying to build rapport and trust with leaders. And one of the leaders in that space that we were going to be collaborating with research on made note to me and said, it's hard for me to say this, but it's important for me to say this. You remind me of the women in my former church that told me I was going to hell. And some of the other people in that space was like, yeah, we're all Black in here, we're all connected, but you remind me and there was like, it's nothing that you said, it's nothing that you've done. You look like the people that the reason why I'm in this space now told me that I was going to hell and have continuously traumatized and abused me my entire life. And so while I share a very deep, deep commitment to this space, and as a Black identified person, I can, connect to historical trauma and lived experience across many of the things that we were sharing in that space. I had to, connect with my co-researcher and say, you know what? I'm going to have to step out because even if me being in this space, knowing that there's so much that we might have in common, but if just visibly the space can't connect to me because they have not yet worked through their own stuff, this isn't the space for them to have to work through it. So I can step out. And so we explained to the folk in that community that Dr. Jones will still be a part of the research. She wants to respect where people are at, so she won't be in these meetings where we're engaged in dialogue. And so receiving that check, receiving that feedback, even though I hadn't done anything wrong, and I'm thinking about researchers who might have agent or privileged identities that you may have not in your mind done anything, but just visibly you may represent a trauma, a pain, or whatever it is. You got to step outside of your ego and you have to say, okay, I'm not meant to do this part of the research. Or ultimately, depending on what it is, you may need to be able to say, I can't do this research. And that's okay. And so for me in that space, it really was taking a step back and saying, okay, I care about the research and the service to this community and how it can have an impact on policy change. I don't have to be the one asking the questions. I don't have to be the one in that space. My co-researcher who connected to that space in a more intentional way and was more open about their identities, they were like, okay, I'm going to lead the research. They feel comfortable with me. They were a Black identified man. They were like, I can be in that space because he didn't represent or look like the women of the church who had, in many ways, ostracized them and caused a lot of the harm. So I would want for folk, because I know we didn't get back to the poll, I don't think, Dr. Jones, if folk thinking about their identities.
I can go to the poll
So,
now. I'll like in this
okay.
and if we have the poll.
Okay. But so
Uh,
for me, while I very much connect to that space, I had to step out and say, if I truly care about this space, and even though I can't change my gender identity or even how I perform my gender, then I have to get out of my ego and say, okay, I can't do it because I care about this space and I want for them to be able to get what they need through this research.
um we have a good representation of so many intersecting identities. So it's really nice. Like we can't see your faces, but it's so nice to be in community with all of you all. And you can see this, right, Dr. Jones?
Yeah, and I was gonna say shout out to the folk that I'm glad to see that we are in a space, especially given that we're under attack in many ways about doing that work of even talking about where you're situated and your identities, that folk are able to say this is me and this is how I identify, and that those categories, those names, those amplifiers are that just kind of matter of fact now. That folk are like, yeah, this, and this. And I hope you know you were proud when you said it. And so it's nice to see that too, because unless you know who you are, you can't go into someone else's space and ask them about who they are and their lived experience. You got to be very familiar with your own.
Yeah, I agree. Shout out to all of you for like your willingness to just say, like Dr. Jones said, that's who I am. And like just kind of a yes, let's do that.
Yeah.
Um, so I think we just have like 5 minutes, and so I'll apologize. We are talkers. We're very big introverts, though. Oh,
Yeah,
Toys
I'm
not.
not.
No, Dr. Jones is not a talker. I'm a talker. Don't ever take a class with me because we will be on the same slide deck for about 3.5 weeks and cover two of them. But Pia, do we have any questions?
Yes,
Okay.
we do. And actually, because we don't have that much time, what I might do is ask, I'll collate the questions that we don't answer today, and I might ask you both to maybe take a look at it and we can
Sure.
respond to the
Yeah,
people who have sent them. So
yeah,
I'll start
absolutely.
with, there was a question about how to maintain a proper distance if your research focuses in a community that you are a part of. So say like if you have a disability and you're interested in is researching ways to widen the inclusivity for those with disabilities. So you are not letting your personal experiences bias your research. So what is your advice in this situation?
Okay, so Dr. Jones, if I answer this completely wrong from my own just perspective and what I've done in life, you tell me, just check me. Um, I don't think you do. Like I have always kind of pushed back on that, like especially as a qualitative researcher, that you can really actually distance yourself. And I know when we get into like, lab work and survey work, you do want to distance yourself. But if you think about going into a community and trying to like maintain some sense of neutrality, there's just no way. Who you are is going to be very present. And I don't think that's wrong. I think I know one thing we do in most of the qualitative methodologies is you expose your biases. So like when I did work, my work, one of my bigger projects is African American response to stroke, because I'm trying to build capacity in my own community to be able to say, we're not always going to be taken seriously. I've had clients who were not taken seriously in the hospital and got denied services and ended up having worse outcomes for their stroke. And so I said, how do we do this? My very first thing that I wrote up was that I am a Black woman with a significant stroke risk who is the child of someone who had a stroke and passed away, and so I cannot divorce myself from this. I will, however, triangulate sources or triangulate my data to make sure that I am not overly representing myself and that I'm authentically or letting the people authentically speak for themselves. But I think there's beauty in research that the researcher actually owns part of it. Like, I mean, Dr. Jones, what are your thoughts?
I was going to say I agree, and the practice of reflexivity statements. That's what you just described there, and I think it's also the importance of not doing research in isolation. That if we're seeking to serve a community, that you also are in community. So if you see yourself more represented in what you're getting in the data, there's someone there that's like, hey, let's talk about what's coming up for you as you do this research. But and we know, especially for my psych folk out there, while we seek to be as unbiased or try to separate ourselves, that's not possible. We show up in our bodies and ourselves every day. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I agree with what you were saying.
I mean, even something what seems like kind of innocuous, like my vowel merger research that I've done with some students, we're looking at how vowels change from Eastern Missouri to Western Missouri. And I swear, even in that, like my students and I, they were undergraduate students, we were sitting there talking about family experiences of language and speech when we would have our team meetings, and there was no way to separate that. And I think it made all of us kind of really geared up for the research. Like we were like, oh my gosh, we get this, like, we literally are studying two vowels, which is, again, not a big deal to most people, but we're like, this is profound. I remember when my grandpa would say this word, and that's how I say it, and that's why other people don't. And so even that kind of stuff you can't separate from.
And another thing that I would add, because there's a way to do this research and be fully in yourself without having to devoid yourself of who you are, if that makes sense. It's so when that stuff comes up for you, because it's ultimately going to come up, you show up in your body every day. It's what you do with it that is the most important, because you can't separate yourself from your lived experiences. And so if it's coming up for you, what do you do with it? That's what makes the difference. How you're checking yourself, and who in your community is holding you accountable. That's the important piece. There's processes that you can be engaged in to really try to push that stuff down, but the research is going to suffer in many ways when you become a blank slate in
And
doing this type of work.
I might add just briefly as we wrap up that, I think some of the things we've seen in the past, like Henrietta Lacks, Tuskegee, there's a couple of other qualitative studies that I'm like missing off the top of my head right now. The researchers try to divorce themselves so much from the human experience that
Right.
that's why some of the atrocities happened. When I can say, regardless of what community I'm in, I am still a human, I still have my identities. How would what I'm doing to these people and these atrocious things, how would I respond to that? I think that's what keeps us more ethical. I think that keeps us more moral in research. And I know we don't necessarily talk about that in health sciences, but there is a morality to research too. And it's in ethics, but I think that helps. Like that, just being a person, like being a human is okay. It's actually kind of beautiful. And we're flawed in what we do. We're going to make mistakes. Like Dr. Jones tells me all the time, you're going to make mistakes. Chill out. Like, and so that's okay.
I think that's a really great place to end in this. Thank you so much to both of you for the presentation. This was really, really insightful. And I can see that the audience was really engaged. We've got so many comments. Thank you for sharing your experience, your research, why you're doing this, why you're interested. So yes, thank you. Thanks everyone for today. And as I said, we'll collate the questions that we couldn't answer, and we will get back to you with an answer, or we might do a blog post perhaps with some of those answers so that everyone has access to it. But yes, thank you so much, and I'll let everyone go now, and hopefully see you for a upcoming webinar. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all. Bye.